Okay, so thank you for coming today. This is a great honor to have Dr. Sonia Nieto here with us and doing a keynote. I've been having her very busy for the last day. No breaks for her. But we are very honored. I wanted to thank the Shepard Symposium on Social Justice for organizing and helping and live streaming and archiving this particular keynote. The Social Justice Research Center has been very generous. The UW Educational Auditorium Center, very generous. The College of Education, very generous. And our Departments of Educational Studies, Secondary Ed, and Curriculum Instruction have also been bringing her here. So thank you very much for all the support. It's nice to see so many people excited that she's coming.
It's not rebooted.
So I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Sonia Nieto. Many of you are familiar with her work, having used them in various classes that you've taken, books of hers that you've read. I've also circulated her bio. She is a graduate, doctorate at University of Massachusetts Amherst. She has many hats, but her most important hat is that of a mother and a grandmother, both of which I found out today are the front covers of the book that I used most in my affirming diversity. Her daughter is on one of the editions, and her granddaughter is on the other of the editions, and so that brings it a little bit more home for me when I look at those now. Affirming Diversity has been a book that I've used in my multicultural diversity classes over the course of the last 20 years. I was at Purdue University, and it was the primary text that we used for that diversity course that we had 9 sections of, and every education student had to take. We used Dr. Nieto's work in the 2480 Diversity and Politics class here on campus for the last 11 years that I have been here. So her work is incredibly important in ESL, bilingual education, diversity, multiculturalism, social justice, and advocacy, all of which are hats that Dr. Nieto wears in her life and career. She's an emeritus faculty of University of Massachusetts Amherst, and yet still incredibly busy every day. She met with a number of our graduate students this afternoon and some great advice about how to get published and what to think about for future careers and what to do to make yourself marketable. So it's a wonderful experience to have her be able to talk to our graduate students. She's met with College of Education faculty and faculty across campus. She's met with our undergraduate classes and our diversity multicultural classes as well. My multicultural class is here today and online, so they're now watching it live. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sonia Nieto.
Can't see faces back there. I like to communicate, you know. But anyway, thank you very much for being here, and I want to thank Dr. Jaime particularly for all the work she's done to bring me here. It's my second visit to Wyoming. I came several years ago when Francisco Rios was the dean. No, when he was, he was a professor here. I want to apologize that it says Colorado here. If you didn't notice, I'm really sorry. I'm a little embarrassed. I forgot to change it. But I've been sort of on a whirlwind speaking in Colorado and Wyoming. And so I've changed. This is based on a talk I gave a couple of days ago. I've changed it, but I forgot to change the name. So it always changes based on where I am. So I want to speak with you today about culturally responsive and socially just teachers and what it takes to become a teacher who is culturally responsive and socially just and what that means. So, you know, to me it's about the kids and the teachers. Of course it's about teachers because I work with teachers. I write about teachers. I include teachers in all the work that I do, in all the work that I write about. But ultimately, it has to be about the kids who we teach and who they teach. So what does it mean, and why is that important? But before we talk about that, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the socio-political context of multicultural education and of education in general, and of schools and of society, because I don't think that we can think about education as isolated from the context in which we're living and in which we're teaching. So, so we have to, schools are not, they don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in a particular context, and that context really helps influence the kind of education that kids get. So that context is also full of lots of barriers, and those barriers include a lingering history of inequality, and that inequality in education has been seen through tradition and policy and practice, whether it is Jim Crow schools, segregated schools in the South, or schools segregated by residential patterns in the North and in the Midwest, or so-called Mexican schools in the Southwest and in California, where students were segregated from their white or other peers if they were Mexican, even if they spoke English fluently, or Native American boarding schools where kids were taken forcibly. And so this is a woeful history of inequality in our schools that we need to be aware of. There's also, we need to be aware of what I call wrong-headed reforms. I also call them deforms, and that includes the obsession with high-stakes testing. It's not that I'm opposed to testing. I think some testing is okay. But we are in such a testing frenzy nowadays that it doesn't let us focus on the real job of teaching. And so that context of Nickleby or No Child Left Behind, which also led to Race to the Top and other kinds of so-called reforms that have led to the blaming of teachers and blaming of students and the surveillance of teachers and so on, are not doing our youngsters too much good. If we say that it's about focusing on the social achievement gap, that's another term I don't like, achievement gap, because when you use that term, there's an assumption that the kids who have the gap are the ones responsible for creating that gap in the first place. And usually it's the policies and practices that have created that gap. And the gap refers to white and some Asian students doing much better than students of color in general. But it's also these reforms by people who know very little about education. So generally, when these so-called reforms are put in place, they are made by policymakers and politicians who know little about education, some of whom have not been in a classroom in years and don't know very much about teaching and learning. And if we look at who's involved in making these policies, it's usually not teachers and not even administrators. And so that's what I call the wrong-headed reforms. And also the privatization of public education, whether it's through charter schools or vouchers. I mean, there are places that there are vouchers for public money being invested in religious schools, even, which I still don't get, given our Constitution. And also the corporate takeover of schools, where corporations are now deciding what schools should be about, and setting the context and setting the policy. And I want to say something about charters, because I know that people have sort of come back to me and saying, but some charters are really good. And yes, some charters are really good. And many charters have been set up by communities of color that are sick and tired of their kids getting the short end of the stick. time after time after time. So I understand that. What bothers me about charters is that they take money away from public education. And public education is, or should be, I think, the bedrock of our democracy. And yet we are losing our way in terms of that. So that's some of the societal barriers. What about the school-based barriers? Well, unequal resources. And, you know, when you walk into a school and you see 100 computers, and you walk into another school and you see 5 computers, you know that there's an inequality of resources. When you walk into a school, and I just heard about this recently, where the newest book that they have is from 1990, and they have hardly any other books, and you walk into another school where they have thousands of books for their students to read, you know that there's inequality. What about the curriculum? If you look at the curriculum in some schools, particularly in schools in poor neighborhoods, there are very few options for students to take high-level courses such as calculus and you know, other sciences and math and even English and social studies kinds of electives. And in other schools, you know, they have all of these things. You know, I was talking to somebody the other day and saying, you know, in our middle school and high school, we still have Latin. I know that's gone in most schools, but I know that in our school they still have it. Until a few years ago, we had not only Latin and Spanish and French, but we also had Russian and Chinese. So, you know, we don't have all of them anymore, but some schools don't have anything but one language, and perhaps 2. So those are school-based barriers, but also, if you look at a well-endowed school, you are sure to find a pedagogy that is different than in a lesser endowed school, where kids have more freedom to explore and to do activity-based learning, whereas in other schools there's sort of a drill and kill type of pedagogy. So all of these are unequal resources that also say something about what we expect of our youngsters. You know, in schools that kids living in poverty attend, often the focus is on basic skills, as if you can't have an enriched curriculum by also teaching basic skills. So those are some of the unequal resources. We also have surveillance of teachers that has happened more and more often. With more prescribed curriculum, teachers are under greater surveillance. They are expected to be on a certain page, on a certain day, teaching the same thing. And so there's a lack of autonomy among teachers. I was saying in a class before that a teacher who wrote in my newest book, not the one that I'm going to be talking about today, which came out a year ago, but one that I just sent in the other day, I asked teachers to write about why they teach now, given this context that I'm reviewing with you. And one of the teachers, Mary Ginley, says, why would anyone who is smart and creative want to go into teaching now? That is a very hard question, and she treats it very critically. Ends up, thank goodness, by saying that she would do it all over again, but it really gives her pause, because that's not the kind of education that she went into 42 years before. She retired after 42 years, but she was able to have a lot more autonomy before. So there's a lack of respect for teachers as well, and for teachers' intelligence. There's also an emotional environment that's different, where we have an unequal distribution of resources of special education, gifted and talented, and as I mentioned, access to higher level courses and retention rates, inadequate outreach to families. So all of these, this creates an emotional environment as well that is unequal. For me, the ideological barrier is even more difficult than these, because I've seen beautiful things done even in the most impoverished environment, impoverished in terms of resources, but when teachers and principals and a school system believes that kids can do it. There's a terrific book written by a friend of mine called Si Se Puede, Yes We Can, about a school in Arizona where the kids all come from poor families, they are all Spanish speakers, and yet the high school graduation rate is very high. The school doesn't have many resources. A lot of the kids go on to college, and she said she had heard about this school. She had to find out for herself, and she did. She did a longitudinal study and found out what are the things that help even these kids in impoverished circumstances learn to high levels. And it includes high expectations. It includes respect for their culture and their language. It includes family outreach, meaningful family outreach. It includes so many things that are intangible. So this emotional, ideological barriers are really important. Now, what do I mean by these? And these are both individual and institutional. Yes, we can have our own biased ideologies, but also an institution can have them. So and these are biases and stereotypes based on race, ethnicity, culture, social class, ability, language, et cetera, et cetera. So, for example, if you believe that poverty will doom you to a life of failure, that's going to get in the way of your teaching to high standards, right? If you believe that these are deficit perspectives, that if you don't have books at home, children don't come to school ready to learn. That is a fallacy. Many kids do not have books at home. I was one of them. We did not have books at home. Did that mean that my parents didn't care about education? No. It just meant that they didn't have the cultural capital that middle-class families had. So don't make assumptions based on where the kids live, where they come from, what language they speak, what race they are. This is the ideological barrier that I think gets in the way so often of having kids learn to the best of their ability. So I call it the expectations gap, not the achievement gap, the expectations gap. There's also the opportunity gap. That is, some kids get to have lots and lots of different opportunities. My daughter taught in a very prestigious private school in New York City. After she taught, first of all, in an after-school program for kids living in poverty in the Bronx. When she went for her interview at this very elite private school, she called us up that night. She had given a sample lesson. They hired her. She did very well there. She was there because she didn't have certification, couldn't teach in a public school yet, which she got years later, and she's now in a public school. But she called us that night and said, wow, it's amazing. These are like college classrooms. There's 8 or 10 kids in a class. They go to all these cultural events. They do all this stuff. She said, my kids from the South Bronx would be brilliant in this school. And that's about the socio-political context and also about, these assumptions based on race, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. That's the opportunity. And the other ideological barrier is the idea that intelligence is fixed and unchanging. And we know that that's not true. And yet, this is a bias that is so hard to fight, as if you will never change based on the circumstances in which you live. And I think our attitude in a democratic society that preaches equality of opportunity, we need to say just the opposite. If you live in impoverished circumstances, we believe you can and you must change. Okay, so let me tell you about all of this led me to think about this question, and this is the book that I wrote based on looking at these issues. So I was sort of tired of the discourse of Oh my goodness, if you teach kids of diverse backgrounds, poor you, because those kids, they are, you know, they don't have much promise, they're really hard to teach, it will make your life impossible, you know, and so on and so forth. I wanted to find teachers who thrive by teaching students of diverse backgrounds. And I found them by, you know, speaking in different places around the country and asking the people who invited me to nominate teachers who thrive and who find joy in teaching, who are not just surviving, but who are thriving. Now, I want to say a word about that because I don't want you to think that these teachers go in jubilant every day. A number of them said, you know, I'm not joyful every single day, and sometimes I feel like I'm just surviving. But in general, they are hopeful, and they do great things with their students. The teachers are very different from one another in what they teach, where they teach all over the country, their age. I mean, one of them was 22 years old, and one of them had been teaching at that point for 39 years. He retired after 40 years. And so they're different in the grade level from early childhood to high school, the subject matter they teach, but what they have in common is this resilience and this hope in the kids who they teach, and this belief in the kids who they teach. They don't see their students as what I've called for years walking sets of deficiencies. You know, what are walking sets of deficiencies? Oh, they don't speak English. Oh, they don't have a father at home. Oh, they don't have books at home. So therefore they can't learn. You know what? It is not our role as teachers to give kids fathers. We can't do that for them. We can only do the best that we can for them. We can try to get books in the home, and there are some good programs that do that. But that alone, if you don't believe in the ability of the kids or the families, you know, won't do a great deal. They don't go to museums. Yeah, maybe they don't go to museums. But that doesn't mean that they cannot learn. And so that's what I mean by walking sets of deficiencies. Instead of thinking about deficiencies, think about abilities. You know, so I always say to people, look, don't think of a child as non-English speaking. Think of that child as Spanish speaking, Vietnamese speaking, Polish speaking, or whatever other language they happen to speak. That turns everything on its head, because then instead of thinking about what they can't do, what they can't accomplish, what they don't have, you think about what they can do, who they are, and the abilities that they have. All kids have abilities, all families have resources, and that's what we need to think about. So I wanted to find teachers who find joy in teaching students of diverse backgrounds, and I wanted to see what lessons they have to teach us. So I went and interviewed these teachers. As you can see, they are quite diverse. Now, there's an overabundance of Latina teachers here, but that's only because of one reason. Well, several reasons. But one reason that this happened is because one of the places that I went to, I asked, it was in California, in LA, and I asked the person who had invited me to speak if she could introduce me to a teacher who found joy in teaching and who was thriving as a teacher. And she said, no, I can't. I can't name one teacher. And I was taken aback. I said, really? And she said, no, I have too many. So she refused to let me interview one teacher. She brought 8 teachers who were bilingual and ESL teachers. So that's why they're overrepresented in this group. And they were magnificent. The others are from all over the country, and I'm going to just focus on a few of them today. I'd like to tell you all of their stories, but there's no time for that. So one thing that was reinforced for me in doing this research is that there is no template for culturally responsive teaching. There's not one best way of being a culturally responsive teacher, and I will even say that there are no such things as best practices. And I know that that's sort of, you know, a real belief among people, that there are best practices. I think there are good practices. There might be excellent practices. There might be interesting practices and promising practices, but best practices assumes that they will be best in all contexts for all learners, and that is not the case. It doesn't work. So we have to learn to be, as teachers and as teacher educators, to provide, that's what differentiation is about, to provide an excellent education for all students who may learn differently, who come to us with specific strengths, specific needs. So no template for culturally responsive teachers, and you'll see that from some of the practices of these teachers. So talking about my own kids, the girl down here is my granddaughter, who my husband and I have raised. She was 13 there, she's 21 now. And I know most of the others. The boy on the other side there, in the middle, is my daughter's a teacher, and one of her students. And the girl above him also was one of her students. So, what are the themes that came up in all of these interviews? So, I'll give you examples of each of these. One is that teaching is an act of love. Also, that it's an ethical endeavor. That teachers thrive when they keep learning. That it's about honoring students' identities and believing in their futures. It's about challenging the status quo, and it's about advocacy. So you see, teaching is advocacy. I remember a teacher once said to me, Sonia, I just realized that teaching is advocacy. It's the same thing. Because if you're not an advocate for your students, you're not really teaching. You have to be an advocate. Now, look at these words up here. These are not the words that we're hearing nowadays. The words that we're hearing nowadays are about AYP, GPA, RTTT. And for those of you, who are familiar with all this stuff, all these letters, they are about rubrics and templates and so on. We don't hear policymakers talking about love, about ethics, about culture, about challenging the status quo, or about advocacy. So I think we need to change the language with which we talk about education. So let's start with teaching as an act of love. This is Angeles Perez. She was a teacher in Houston when I interviewed her about, over 4 years ago. It was maybe 5. It was her second year of teaching. She's now an assistant principal, which I feel bad about for kids, but good about for the school. She did all those things. She challenged the status quo. She taught with love, all of those things. And a lot of these teachers embody all of these things, but I'm taking specific examples. So how does she teach as an act of love with empathy and solidarity and high expectations and respect? So she was this 4th grade bilingual teacher when I interviewed her. And she was incredibly enthusiastic. So I said to her, well, how do you teach? And she said, I pride myself on getting them to set their goals. So she helps kids set their own goals for the year. And she said, and they're not low goals, they're high goals. And she said that the first year she wasn't taken very seriously because people thought, who is this 22-year-old who's so sure of what she's doing? So she said she wasn't taken very seriously the first year, but after her students exceeded all expectations on the statewide test, the high-stakes test, she was viewed very differently by her peers. And all of a sudden, they started paying attention to her. Also, she was a bilingual teacher, and her kids were taking the test in English, and they did very well. They got very high scores. Also, she was ecstatic, she said, because one of her fourth grade students, she taught in a school that was K to 5, and they had a spelling bee, and every year the spelling bee was won by an English-speaking fifth grader. This year, it was one of her students, fourth grade bilingual student. So she said, I don't mean to brag, but my student just won the spelling bee. I can't believe it. I felt like I won the spelling bee. I'm their biggest fan, she said. Their success is my success, I guess. She said she ran out of the room, ran down shouting, my student won the spelling bee, because nobody expected it. She also instituted something that she called hanging out with Miss Bettis time. At the end of the day, she devoted 10 minutes of the day to just hang out with her students. This didn't take away from her high expectations. On the contrary, she wanted to show them that she was a person like she is a person like they are, that she can have a personal relationship with them. And they would do all sorts of things, like talk to her about what it's like to be a teacher. And sometimes the girls would just paint their nails in those 10 minutes while they were talking to her. They would just hang out. At the end of the year, a good number of those students decided that they wanted to be teachers. That is powerful. That is very powerful. This is somebody who's very different, Carmen Tisdale. Carmen is, she's been teaching for about 15 years, maybe more now, and in Columbia, South Carolina. She's a second grade teacher. She's also a national board certified teacher and a former teacher of the year. She said that sometimes you have to love children in spite of themselves. She said, I think to be a good teacher, you need to love children in spite of themselves. And she talked about a particular student who we'll call Geneva, who tried her patience every day. So she said she had to learn to go in and love Geneva more every day and show her that she cared about her. When she left that school and went to her current school, she's still in touch with some of her co-teachers there, and one of them said to her that Geneva asks about her every single day because she felt loved, even though she was a difficult child. Also, Carmen identifies herself as a black mama. Now, what does that mean? She says, we just have, I'm sure all cultures do a certain way of talking. There's a rhythm to it. We all bring our culture in the classroom, whether we realize it or not. And, some people don't realize that. But when you walk in with all of yourself. You walk in with your culture, whether you want to or not. So the good thing is to be aware of it and not let it get in the way of your teaching, but rather to enhance your teaching. So that's what she did. She was teaching, at this point, she was teaching all African American kids. And she said that, when she had been teaching in a school that was more diverse and she had some white kids in South Carolina, some of her white kids were a little put off by her black mama stance. She had to cool it. She had to be careful with how she came across. But she said, I'm teaching all black children now. And she said, so I might say, get your behind over there and sit down. And she said, that's what your black mama would say. And it's not to say that every black mama would say it. She says that black dialect creates a mutual understanding with her students. And she says, you know how it is. You're the social worker and advocate. You are the mama. For example, I'm putting shea butter on your little ashy face. She said, that's what your mama does. So this is not to say that all of you should become black mamas. You cannot. Okay, just let me make that clear. You cannot. But the good thing is that you need to recognize that this is an approach that can work with kids, even if you don't do it yourself, and to support it and to identify it. It's the same as when I was a teacher in a bilingual school in the Bronx. And all my kids were Latinos, mostly Puerto Rican. And when I would take my fourth graders down to dismiss them at the end of the day, they would stand in line and ask for my blessing at the end of the day. Especially all the girls. The boys would too, but then they run off. But the girls would say, La bendición maestra, which means, give me your blessing, please. It's a very Puerto Rican cultural thing. And I would say, que Dios te bendiga, may God bless you. I don't see it as a religious thing at all. I see it as a cultural thing. And all the girls would line up to kiss me, good afternoon. You don't have to do that. But it's to know that it really helps with some students to have somebody who's like them and who they can relate to. You know? It's also important that all students get to learn from all kinds of teachers who are different from them. But being culturally responsive means that you understand that you understand where that is coming from. Also, Carmen really believes in her students. For example, she had a student who we'll call Jamal, who told her that he wanted to be a bus driver. And she said, so I'm always the one to say, I want you to think about owning a fleet of buses. This is about high expectations. And she said, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be a bus driver, if that's what you really want to do. But if you know nothing else, she said, this is what the kids see. This is the person in their neighborhood who has a job, and he drives a school bus. And that's okay. But they haven't thought about other opportunities, and she said, I think that's my role, to tell them about other opportunities. It's my place to show him that he can be more, and he needs to be more. And that's about high expectations. Teaching is an ethical endeavor, and this is Amber Bouchard, who is currently an 8th grade language arts teacher in Plainfield, Illinois. She is also board certified. She's also an adjunct professor at 2 local universities in the Chicago region. And this is how, and that's current. This is how I met Amber. I met her about a dozen years ago or so. She came to my office and said, Professor Nieto, please let me into your multicultural curriculum class. My husband is being transferred to Chicago, and I know nothing about multicultural education, and I know I'll be teaching a diverse group of students there. She was teaching in an elite private school. She was teaching kindergarten kids, almost all of whom were white and wealthy. So of course I said she could come into the class even though it was over-enrolled. So she was a phenomenal student, soaking in everything. In fact, when she moved to Chicago, she got a job teaching, as I said, 7th and 8th grade language arts. So when I interviewed her years later, I said, kindergarten, 7th and 8th grade language arts? How was that for you? And she said, I love it all, because I love the process of teaching and learning. She was so enthusiastic, so inspired by multicultural education that she decided to do a doctorate in multicultural education. So she now has a doctorate. Every summer she takes different seminars, she is truly an example of something else that I'll be talking about learning all the time. So she talked about how in the course that she had taken with me, she had discussed issues of race, power, and privilege with her kindergarten students, but in a way that they could understand, in a way that she made it part of the curriculum. And she found that teaching with a multicultural perspective is about taking an ethical stance, because it means affirming all students who you teach. But as a white woman, she said she had never thought that she could do that, because she said, I just needed someone to say, you don't have to be black to do this. Wow, such an important message. So I'll repeat it. You don't have to be black to do this. In fact, it's important that no matter what race or ethnicity you are, that you become a culturally responsive and socially just teacher for all your students. It's really important that you do that. And there's even an extra responsibility, I think, on majority group teachers, because they don't necessarily know about these things, and so they have to learn them. Okay. And so she said, I needed you to say, it's okay if you don't know it. So her curriculum, which she prepares collaboratively with her colleagues, has become increasingly multicultural in her middle school, and so she now engages all students and even their families in courageous conversations about difference and privilege. And she spoke, for example, about how she had taken the information and perspective from our course to the kindergarten students, and she sometimes had difficult conversations with them about power and privilege, but in a way that they could understand. So they talked about, for example, is it fair? Are things fair when some kids don't have the same opportunities as other kids do? That's how you approach it with kids who, you know, might not understand about talking about racism. You know, you don't necessarily have to use these terms, but you do have to talk about other issues of fairness that kids as little as 3 and 4 and 5 will understand. So when she moved to Chicago, she became, as I said, a 7th grade language arts teacher in a rapidly changing suburb. And she said, having had those conversations with 5 and 6-year-olds, the courage to have them with my colleagues and with 14 and 15-year-olds in my middle school. So she brought a multicultural perspective also to everything that she does. So for example, she started a multicultural club in her school. They had never had anything like that. And now 3 middle schools have multicultural clubs because of what she started. And she also has worked a lot with parents and with other teachers. So, for example, they have a yearly culture fair. So one student, the first year that she did it, that she did the cultural fair, made a video depicting prejudice through music. Another one interviewed fellow students about why they sit with only students of the same race or background. And others have done family genealogy projects. So, for example, one said, I never knew I was related to Billie Holiday. That's cool, you know, because they did this project. So, Amber is a great example of this, that teachers thrive when they keep learning. So is John. So were all the teachers, but they learn in different ways. You know, as I said, Amber keeps taking different seminars. She has gotten a couple of Fulbrights, at least 2 or 3 Fulbrights. She's gone to South Africa, she's gone to Brazil, gone to Mexico, and all paid for because she's applied for these things, which I think all teachers need to do. But this is John Nguyen, and he was the winner of the Milken National Family Foundation Educator Award. He's now an assistant principal in New Haven, Connecticut. But when I interviewed him, he was a high school social studies teacher. He was inspired by his grandfather, who was a chemistry teacher in Vietnam, and he decided in 8th grade that he wanted to be a teacher too. And so when he was 13 years old, imagine that, he decided that, not that he wanted to be a teacher, he knew that, he decided that he better start getting some experiences under his belt so he could become a better teacher. And so what did he do to become a good social studies teacher? Because that's what he knew he wanted to do. Well, first of all, in high school, he volunteered for the AIDS quilt project in Connecticut, and he was the only high school student in the state to do that. That was a number of years ago. I'm sure there's more high school students now. But he also volunteered for Habitat for Humanity and for Amnesty International. During college, he took a year off to join AmeriCorps, working on cleaning up the floods in New Orleans and setting up a teen center in Baltimore, among other projects. As an undergraduate student in college at the University of Connecticut, he received academic credit for doing an internship with the National Council for the Social Studies. I mean, how many undergraduate students are so focused that they know exactly what they want to do? So he did this internship in Washington, D.C., and he went to Vietnam with his geography professor and got credit for that. And he also studied in London, afterwards traveling throughout Europe for several months. He said he loves teaching social studies because it gives him the opportunity to discuss meaningful topics with his students, topics that help them question the current state of affairs. He considers himself a teacher with a social justice perspective. When I first interviewed, he was, as I said, a high school social studies teacher at this high school in New Haven, Connecticut that was one of 2 default schools for kids who didn't get into any of the other high schools. So it's not that they had the cream of the crop, as they would say, but they had kids who had no other recourse but to go to the school. And he did amazing things with these kids. The school was about 80% African American, 19% Latino, and 1% other, meaning, I suppose, white. The 1% white. It's, he says, if you don't get into one of the other schools, you sort of indirectly come to our school. He was the only Asian teacher in his school, and both the students and the staff, these perceptions about, you know, what it was to be an Asian teacher. He said, most of my students didn't know what to make of me. He said their only previous knowledge of Asians had been either the Chinese delivery guy or a particular actor on a TV show. He worked hard at confronting these perceptions, saying that's the first thing, dispelling stereotypes. He said, and we continued to do that throughout the year. Even one of his colleagues, an African-American teacher, who he didn't really know at first, she had very serious doubts that he would make it in that school. And you know, there's a history of tension with Asians and African-Americans, and so they looked at him with a lot of suspicion. This woman had said, there's no way that Asian guy is going to survive. She's now one of his best friends. And he is a very beloved teacher. He was at that school. He's no longer there. He was also severely tested by his students the first year. He said there were discipline problems, and said he was called awful things. But he had made the decision, a purposeful decision, that he wanted to teach in a school like that. He said, I didn't want to teach in a homogeneous school like most of Connecticut. I wanted an area where I could make a lot of impact and change, and that's why he chose to go to a New Haven public school. So he said, I wanted to teach the students who for the most part have been neglected. So as a result, he never taught, and this is another decision that he made, he made the decision never to teach AP courses or honors courses. He wanted to teach the so-called regular students who might never have these opportunities. So, how does he develop close and meaningful relationships with his students? First of all, he related to their experiences. For in area in Danbury, information, his story as a member of an immigrant family that really relates to some of the experience of his students. And he also asks them to write their personal stories. He also encourages honest conversations about race, socioeconomic privilege, and difference. And he does exciting things in the school. So for example, he served on a jury years ago, and he got friendly with the judge. You know, imagine that. So he invited her to visit his school, and every year she would go and visit his school and do 5 classes talking about being a lawyer and being a judge. This is about high expectations, right? He also gave the example of a news story about the murder of Annie Lee. And some of you may remember that story a few years ago in the news. It was a Yale graduate student who, like John, was Vietnamese, and she had been killed, and so it was all over the newspaper. She was a graduate student in one of the sciences, maybe biology. And so one day a student asked why the death of a Yale student got more publicity in the news than the death of a Hill House student. Why? You know, where a lot more Hill House students are shot, or, you know, urban students are shot and killed. And he said he was sick and tired of this. So John said, we talk about whose life is more valuable, a Yaley's life or a Hill House student's life. Naturally, everyone is going to say it's the same, but I posed the question as, the average person in Connecticut, what would they think? He said this was followed by a thoughtful conversation that carried over to other classes. And he said it ended up being an amazing lesson about media and socioeconomic issues. To this day, I've never forgotten that lesson and the students involved. It was one of those days you cherish as a teacher. He also believes in students' intelligence. He believes that they can do the work that he makes sure that they do. Also, teaching is about honoring students' identities and believing in their futures, and this is Yolanda Harris. When I met her in upstate New York at Nazareth College, where I was speaking, I asked other teachers who were there who they would recommend for me to interview somebody who found joy in teaching, and they all pointed at Yolanda. Yolanda was not a teacher. She was a paraprofessional, but they all felt that she was the perfect example of somebody who found joy in teaching. She was a teacher's assistant, and she never thought that she would go on to higher education because she herself had a hard time in high school and said, okay, that's it, I am never going back to school. And she started working in a beauty salon. And that's what she was doing when a friend of hers who had become a paraprofessional encouraged her to go back to community college and get a degree so she could become a paraprofessional. So she did, and she surprised herself at doing so well. She breezed through it and finished her degree, her associate's degree, and then decided, I've come this far to become a paraprofessional, maybe I can become a teacher. So when I met her, she was studying to be a teacher at Nazareth College. The last I heard from her, she was studying for her master's degree in English education. And I think she's already a teacher. Now, but with certification to teach secondary school students with disabilities. That's what she's always done. So I sent her the chapter in which she was featured in the book that I wrote to ask what she felt about it. I always gave the teachers the opportunity to make any changes, to see if they want to add something, and so on. So she wrote back, and she was in a chapter where she was featured with two other teachers, Maria Acevedo and John Gunderson, and she said, after reading not only my story, but the stories of John and Maria, I found myself both laughing and shedding tears about how much I have grown both personally and professionally, and about my boys. She calls them my boys, the students who she taught. She was the only teacher who taught all boys with in special education, mostly with behavioral issues. And and the many students that I've managed to make an impression on over the years. My hope is that things will get better because others start to see what we see in our children. So the young men of color with whom she works have emotional and psychological issues, and most are labeled ED or emotionally disturbed. They are viewed, according to Yolanda, as the troubled kids, the kids that are not going to get anywhere in life. The kids that are going to end up in jail or dead, and that's the message that they keep getting. But she has a special way with these young men, and she refuses to give up on them. She says, I like working with the boys. In fact, when she was graduating from Nazareth, she asked to be placed in a class working with her boys, the boys who have these, who are labeled ED. She said, I like working with the boys because I love to see students who feel like I did. I can't do it. And then have that moment when they see they can do it. There is no better feeling. That's that feeling of accomplishment that only teachers know, right, when it works. She also expects a lot from her students, and she has a stubborn belief in them and what they can do and can become. So she also relates personally to their experiences. She says, hey, one of the things I tell them during the tough times is, I'm from the same streets you're from. I'm here to tell you there is a better way, but you have to believe that for yourself. You need to have an understanding of what's going on in their lives, what is important to them. They need to have some sense of their value, that you're not just this person who goes to spend 6 hours a day with them, but who could care less about them, They want to know that you appreciate them being there. So these are all lessons that we can learn from these teachers. Teaching is also about challenging the status quo, and this is John Gunderson, who teaches high school, mostly psychology classes. He says he's been so lucky because he doesn't have to deal so much with the high-stakes testing, although he's been asked to do some other classes now where they have these provisions. He's also an adjunct professor at Chapman University. He teaches in a privileged white school in Southern California, a school where he was a student, and he never thought he'd be a teacher. And then he said he stepped into a classroom one day and said, this is what I have to do, and he's been doing it for 20 years. He said, the best decision I've ever made. I was like, I'm going to teach for the rest of my life. 22 years later, he's still at Dana Hills, the school, the town where he teaches. He challenges the status quo in many ways. For example, he says, education is about improving the human condition, not just getting high scores on tests. So he does a lot of curriculum on having students examine who they are. After all, it's a psychology class. So for instance, he includes issues of inequality in his curriculum. He wants to make sure that students learn, and this is in a privileged town that is mostly white. These are topics that he feels everyone needs to grapple with. He says, I love that in every class I teach, I do a unit on prejudice and racism to try to get the students to be more aware of the power of our own biases and how we use them to judge people. Because after all, he said, how can you not talk about racism and prejudice in psychology? It's part of the very meat of psychology. It's a huge construct, he said. So also, he's a teacher of mostly privileged young white women who, as an adjunct in the college that he teaches at. And these young women have had little personal experience with racial and other kinds of diversity. So he began using Lisa Delpit's Other People's Children several years ago, a book that everybody should read, everybody who's going to be a teacher. He sees it as a very effective teaching tool, but he knows that it's also very challenging for people who haven't confronted issues of racism because they've never had to confront them. So, but, you know, people sort of react in a negative way, they feel guilty about it, but he said that when he first read it as a teacher, his first response wasn't to feel threatened. Instead, he said, how many kids have I hurt? That's a really good question for teachers to ask. How many kids will I hurt if I don't know about these things? He said, I don't take it as a personal attack. So many of the people in my classes take it as a personal attack, like I'm not racist, but he introduces these things little by little, and he gives them a chance to digest and to talk and to really reflect on these things. But he's also fed up with what he calls this behavioristic mill that education has become. He says his goal for students is not to make them better test takers so that they can play Jeopardy later in life, but to make them thinkers who can really make a difference. For him, education is about improving the human condition. He says teaching is about relationships. It's not about knowing how to do a lesson plan. And finally, this is Roger Wallace. Roger was a teacher in so he's not one of the teachers who was recommended to me. I've known him for 39 years. We walked into the first class that I took as a doctoral student together. He was a master's student, I was a doctoral student, and he was a teacher. And he taught for 40 years. We just named an award in Amherst after him. It's the only award named after a teacher, except for one at the high school that's named after Robert Frost, who was a little better known, right? Roger was an amazing teacher. He was the only African-American male teacher in his school in all the years that he taught. There were a few African-American women who came in and out. But he teaches a very diverse group of students. He taught white, African-American, Latino, Cambodian, and others. And also in terms of social class, there's a great deal of diversity. And he hadn't originally planned to become a teacher. He had wanted to be a lawyer because he wanted to be a juvenile justice lawyer working with kids who get in trouble. He was at Clark University in Worcester, and he was a scholarship kid. He grew up with a mother who relied on welfare and raised wonderful kids who paid back in many, many ways whatever, whatever she benefited from, because she was a great mother who really pushed them. So he then had he did an after-school internship and got so hooked on it that he said, where can I work with a body of kids before they get into a great deal of trouble? And decided that it wasn't as a juvenile justice lawyer, it was as a teacher. So I have to be a teacher. So that's when he became a teacher. He said there's no greater calling for him, and as a black man, he says he has certain responsibilities because part of his cultural legacy is to accept all children for who they are, rather than what he or anyone else expects them to be. He said he's tired of teachers who say, you know, that they want all the kids to be the same. He said, all kids are not the same, you know, and that some teachers seem to believe that they will teach their kids until they won't teach their kids until they're ready to learn, and they're ready to learn when they become like all the kids. And he says, look, it ain't gonna work. He knows proper English, by the way. This is for emphasis. He says, they ain't never gonna be white. Can you teach them as they are instead of as I'll teach them when they become what I want them to be, and then they'll be ready to learn. He said they're ready to learn. They need to learn now. So when I said to him, so what does it mean to be an effective teacher of students of diverse backgrounds, including white students? He said, if you want to be a successful teacher of children of diverse backgrounds, put your stuff away. That means the stuff that I talked about before. That means your biases, your preconceptions, you know, the how you're judging kids based on what you see rather than on what they really have. He said, no two kids are alike, and each has his or her own talents. And I should say that Roger has been such a beloved teacher of kids that, well, I already told you about the award, but kids have come back 30 years later. These kids are almost as old as he is now. And he has made a difference in the lives of more white children than of any others, because that's who he's taught. There's always a long waiting list of parents who want kids in his classroom because he was such a phenomenal teacher. So he said his stepfather was a skilled carpenter. And he told Roger, there's never a bad piece of wood. There's only wood that needs extra planing. Talk about wisdom, right? So you have to find, he said, the right purpose for that piece of wood. And so you keep working at it. At the same time, he has really high expectations for all his students. And he said, they don't pass 2 vocabulary tests and see if I don't show up at their house and say, where do you study your vocabulary? How do you study? Let's go to your room and organize. No parent has ever gotten angry at him. He also gives his number to all the parents, to all the kids, and tells them they can call him anytime. His cell phone number, his home number. Again, you don't need to do this as a teacher. That doesn't have to be you. But that's how he does it. And he's an incredibly effective teacher. He's also an advocate for parents and families, and he builds relationships with parents by meeting them where they'll feel most comfortable. And he explains, I thrive because I like to have parent conferences in laundromats. If I know a parent goes to a laundromat on Thursdays, I show up with clean hands and an attitude to fold everything but the underwear. He says he has that country doctor philosophy because education is not a 9-to-3 job. He sees himself as a friend, a neighbor, and a counselor to his students. He goes to all his students' activities. He's not crazy about ballet, but he never misses a ballet performance. He goes to all the games. He goes to everything that they do. And so for them, he's like a member of the family. He also, I should say, has kids, one of whom is a teacher now. So he says to teach kids of diverse backgrounds, you have to be someone who can learn to shuffle a lot of cards. This means being effective with all students, with all of them. So, what can we learn from culturally responsive and socially just teachers? First, the necessity to engage in critical self-reflection. Really an important lesson. We saw that I saw that with all the teachers who I interviewed. I didn't give you examples of all of that, but they all question themselves. Why am I here? Why am I doing this? You know, really important. Hard work, but very necessary. They insist on excellent work from all students because they know that the most marginalized students are the students who need the most pushing, who need the most enthusiasm and motivation, and who need the most belief in themselves. They honor families. Roger's certainly a good example of that. All the teachers were. They show how they honor families by inviting them in, communicating with them, and honoring who they are. They exemplify commitment to lifelong learning. You saw that with John, with Amber, with Yolanda, with all of them, Oh, by the way, Angeles Perez, I just heard from her the other day. She asked me to write a letter of support for her because she is in a doctoral program now. So that's about lifelong learning. And they reject deficit perspectives. And that's really, really, I think, the bottom line. Because they understand that all students have assets, and that these assets are not to be disparaged or dismissed. They understand that no language is inferior, that no culture is, quote, a culture of poverty, and that students' identities and experiences are rich resources upon which they can build. They can build their curriculum, they can build the relationship. They recognize that good teaching is political work, and I know that that's a hard word for some people. But you can use advocacy instead. It's really the same thing. It's about power. Who has power? How is it used? You know, and in the end, it really is about Paulo Freire's question. If you don't know Paulo Freire, ask your professors and read Pedagogy of the Oppressed and many other books that he wrote that changed how I think about education. And one of his fundamental questions was, for whom and on whose behalf am I teaching? A fundamental question for all of us to ask. Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, gee, I went over a little bit. I'm sorry.
We'll take questions now if you have any.
Yeah.